My father died, leaving me the business he built all his life. But my stepmother decided she was smarter than everyone else, forged documents and took over the company for herself. She thought I couldn't do anything about it, until people in suits walked in on her day of triumph and declared her bankrupt. I still remember the day my father opened his first auto repair shop. I was only 8 years old, but he made sure I was there, standing beside him as he cut the ribbon across the garage door of what would become Hartwell Auto Services. He rested his large, calloused hand on my shoulder and said, "Alex, someday all of this will be yours. Everything I build is for you." Dad was a self-made man in every sense of the word. He'd started fixing cars in his parents' garage at 16, saved enough to rent a small commercial space by 23, and by the time I was born, he owned that first proper garage free and clear. He built his business the old-fashioned way, honest work, fair prices, and expertise that kept customers coming back. I practically grew up in those garages. After school, I'd do homework in the office, then help sweep floors or organize tools. By 16, I was working on cars myself. By 22, after finishing my business degree, I was managing our third location. Dad's dream was expanding into a proper chain across the Midwest, and we were well on our way. Then came Meredith. She walked into our flagship garage one rainy Tuesday afternoon, driving a Mercedes with engine trouble. She was 15 years younger than my father, barely 10 years older than me, with auburn hair, designer clothes, and a laugh that seemed to light up my father's face in a way I hadn't seen since Mom died. I wanted to be happy for him. I really did. After losing Mom to cancer 5 years earlier, Dad deserved companionship. But something about Meredith always felt calculated to me. The way her eyes would scan the garage, assessing equipment. How she'd ask pointed questions about our finances when she thought I wasn't listening. The way she'd touch Dad's arm and whisper in his ear whenever the conversation turned to business expansion. "You're being paranoid," Dad told me when I finally voiced my concerns, about 6 months after they'd started dating. "Meredith cares about me. She's just interested in my life." They married 3 months later. I stood as best man, smiling through clenched teeth. To be fair, Meredith played her part well. For the first year of their marriage, she was the perfect wife, hosting business dinners, accompanying Dad to industry events, even bringing lunch to the garages for the mechanics sometimes. She worked as a financial consultant, and gradually, Dad began asking her advice on business matters. "She's got a mind for money," he'd say proudly. Things I never even thought of. I tried to stay neutral, focusing on running our now 5 locations. Dad was still the beating heart of the business, the visionary, the mechanic everyone respected, the boss who knew every employee's kids' names. I was his right hand, handling day-to-day operations, hiring, training. We were a team. Until the heart attack. It happened so suddenly. Dad was only 58, still strong, still working alongside mechanics when a complex problem needed his expertise. One minute he was joking with the crew, the next he was on the floor. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The world blurred after that. The funeral. The condolences. The hollow feeling in my chest when I walked into the main garage and didn't hear his booming laugh or the clang of his favorite wrench. "We need to talk about the business, Alex," Meredith said a week after the funeral, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. "Your father would want us to keep things running smoothly." I nodded numbly. Of course Dad would want that. He'd built this company from nothing. His legacy deserved to continue. "The lawyer will read the will tomorrow," I said. But we both know what Dad wanted. He always said I'd take over someday. I tried to smile. "You don't have to worry, Meredith. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Something flickered in her eyes, amusement, maybe, but she quickly composed her face into a mask of grief. "We'll see what James wanted," she said softly. The next day changed everything. The attorney, Mr. Patterson, had been Dad's friend for years. He looked uncomfortable as he arranged papers on the conference table in his office. Meredith sat across from me, dressed in a black suit that looked more business than bereavement. "Before we begin," Patterson said, "I want to say that this came as a surprise to me too, Alex. Your father made these changes, recently." My stomach tightened. "What changes?" He cleared his throat and began reading. "The family home to Meredith. The vacation cabin to Meredith. And Hartwell Auto Services, all 5 locations, equipment, accounts, and assets, to Meredith." What the hell? I stood up so quickly my chair toppled backward. "That's impossible. Dad would never do that." Meredith dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "James was concerned about your readiness, Alex. He told me he thought you needed more seasoning before taking on such responsibility." "That's bull," I caught myself, trying to breathe. "We talked about this constantly. The business was always meant for me. Always." Patterson looked pained. "I'm sorry, Alex. The documents are in order. Signed and witnessed." "When?" I demanded. "When did he make these changes?" 3 weeks before his death," Patterson said quietly. Meredith gave me a sympathetic smile. "He wasn't feeling well in those final weeks. I think he wanted to ensure stability." I stared at the papers. My father's signature looked different somehow. Not quite right. But I couldn't prove anything. "There must be something for me," I said finally. Patterson nodded uncomfortably. "You receive a cash bequest of $50,000, and your father expressed his hope that you would continue working in the business under Mrs. Hartwell's direction." The room seemed to spin. $50,000. For a lifetime of work. And the suggestion that I should now work for my stepmother, who was barely older than me. "This isn't right," I said, looking directly at Meredith. "You did something." Her face hardened slightly before softening into a grieving widow's expression. "You're upset, Alex. I understand. Why don't you take some time? The door will always be open for you at Hartwell Auto." I walked out without another word. The next few weeks were a blur of anger and investigation. I tried to talk to mechanics, office staff, anyone who might have noticed my father acting strangely before his death. Most were sympathetic but hadn't seen anything unusual. Dad's old secretary, Margaret, was the only one who seemed troubled. "Your father never mentioned changing his will to me," she said cautiously when we met for coffee. "And he told me everything. In fact." She hesitated. "What?" I pressed. "The week before he died, he was talking about officially making you co-owner. Said it was time." That night, I drank myself into oblivion. Meanwhile, Meredith moved fast. Within a month, she'd fired Margaret and 3 other longtime employees. She brought in her own financial team. Started selling off equipment from our newest location, claiming consolidation. The Hartwell name remained, but Dad's philosophy of quality service at fair prices quickly gave way to cutting corners and maximizing profit. I watched from a distance, using my connections with mechanics who still reported to me in secret. My father's legacy was being dismantled piece by piece. The tipping point came when Mike, our best mechanic who'd worked for Dad for 20 years, called me in tears. "She's selling the original garage, Alex. The first one your dad opened. Some developer wants to tear it down for a mini-mall." Something inside me hardened into resolve. Playing fair clearly wasn't an option anymore. I started with Clark Bennett, Dad's old accountant whom Meredith had replaced with her own people. Clark had known my father for decades and was equally disturbed by what was happening. "I can't prove anything," he said as we met in a diner far from any of the garages, "but the timing is suspicious. Your father never mentioned changing his will to me, and I handled all his financial planning." I need to see the books, I told him. The real ones, from before she took over. Clark hesitated. I don't have access anymore, but... He lowered his voice. I made backups of everything. Force of habit. Those backups became my roadmap. I spent nights poring over spreadsheets, transaction histories, client records. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The business had been even more successful than I'd realized. Dad had been quietly acquiring properties for future expansion and building significant cash reserves. Assets that were now rapidly disappearing under Meredith's control. I also visited the county clerk's office, requesting copies of all recent documents filed for Hartwell Auto. Among them was a power of attorney form supposedly signed by my father 3 months before his death, giving Meredith full authority over his business decisions, in case of incapacitation. He was never incapacitated, I muttered, studying the signature. It looked close to Dad's, but something was off about the pressure points and slant. My next stop was a handwriting expert, a retired detective named Harris who now consulted on forgery cases. After examining samples of Dad's genuine signature alongside the will and power of attorney documents, he looked up grimly. I'd stake my reputation on it. These signatures were forged. Good forgeries, but definitely not authentic. It was the ammunition I needed, but I knew a direct legal attack would be risky. Meredith had resources now, my father's resources, and could drag out a court battle for years. I needed to be smarter. I approached my strategy from multiple angles. First, I reconnected with Jacob Turner, owner of Turner Automotive, our biggest local competitor. Dad and Jacob had maintained a respectful rivalry for years. I'm sorry about your father, Jacob said when we met at his office. James was a good man and a straight shooter. What's happening to his business is a damn shame. I laid out what I knew, the forged documents, the asset stripping, the dismantling of everything Dad had built. Then I made my proposal. I need leverage. Financial leverage. Jacob studied me carefully. What exactly are you asking? Meredith is taking on debt to fund her lifestyle while gutting the business. I need someone to buy that debt. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You want me to become her creditor? Exactly. She won't know it's you. Use a holding company. But when the time comes, I want those debts called in simultaneously. He drummed his fingers on his desk. That's aggressive, Alex. She stole my inheritance through fraud. I'm just trying to recover what my father wanted me to have. After a long pause, Jacob nodded. Your father would have done the same for his son. I'm in. Next, I approached Davis Mitchell at First Midwest Bank, who had handled Hartwell Auto's accounts for years before Meredith moved them to her preferred institution. Like many others, Davis had respected my father deeply. I need information, I told him bluntly. I know you can't give me account details, but you can tell me if there were unusual transactions before my father died. Davis's expression was troubled. There were withdrawals. Large ones. Not authorized by your father directly, they were done with the power of attorney. Before or after his death? Davis met my eyes. Both. The final piece came from an unexpected source. One of Meredith's new financial team members, a young analyst named Rachel, reached out to me directly. I don't think things are right at Hartwell, she said nervously when we met at a park far from the offices. The books don't make sense. There's money moving into personal accounts, business expenses that don't look legitimate. I thought you should know. Why tell me this? I asked. Rachel looked down. Your dad gave my brother a job when no one else would, because of his record. Said everyone deserves a second chance. My brother says you're the same kind of person. With Rachel providing inside information, Jacob acquiring Meredith's mounting business debts through shell companies, and Clark helping me document every financial irregularity, I built my case methodically over 6 months. I also filed a quiet complaint with the IRS, documenting specific tax issues based on Rachel's information. During this time, Meredith grew bolder. She sold 2 more locations, fired most of the experienced mechanics, and replaced them with cheaper labor. Customer complaints mounted. The Hartwell reputation, built over decades, was crumbling in months. I waited for the perfect moment to strike. It came when Meredith announced a partnership celebration to mark the sale of the flagship garage, Dad's original location, to a regional chain. She'd invited business associates, local media, even the mayor. It was to be her crowning achievement, the final dismantling of my father's legacy and her emergence as a successful businesswoman in her own right. I made sure I had a seat at the reception. The event was held at an upscale hotel ballroom. Meredith stood at the podium in an expensive dress, champagne glass in hand, talking about exciting new directions and honoring James Hartwell's vision through evolution. I sat silently at a back table, watching. She hadn't even acknowledged my presence. Halfway through her speech, the ballroom doors opened. 3 groups of people entered simultaneously, approaching from different directions. A woman in a sharp suit walked directly to the podium, flashing identification. Mrs. Hartwell. I'm Agent Spencer with the Internal Revenue Service. We need to discuss some discrepancies in Hartwell Auto's tax filings immediately. Before Meredith could respond, a second group approached, 2 men in expensive suits. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Robert Klein representing Midwest Holdings. We're calling in your outstanding loans, effective immediately. Full payment is due within 24 hours per the acceleration clause triggered by your default on the Turner property loan. Meredith's face drained of color. What are you talking about? What Turner property? The third individual, my father's old lawyer, Patterson, approached with a thick folder. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm serving you with legal documents regarding the estate of James Hartwell. These include charges of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Reporters who had come to cover a simple business acquisition suddenly found themselves with a much bigger story. Meredith's eyes darted frantically around the room before landing on me. I raised my glass slightly, meeting her gaze. This is ridiculous, she spluttered into the microphone. I don't know what games my stepson is playing, but... It's no game, I said, standing up. All eyes turned to me. It's justice. For my father and for everyone who worked for him. The next few hours were chaos. Meredith was escorted out by the IRS agent. The bankers began sealing documents. Patterson pulled me aside. Alex, I need to tell you something. After you left that day, I kept thinking about your father's signature. It didn't sit right with me either. I should have investigated sooner. It's done now, I said quietly. The aftermath was swift and complete. The fraud investigation revealed that Meredith had been planning this for over a year, cultivating my father, manipulating him, and ultimately forging documents after his death. The IRS audit uncovered substantial tax evasion. And the simultaneous calling of all business loans, now owned by Jacobs holding companies, forced an immediate bankruptcy proceeding. Within weeks, Meredith lost everything, the business, the house, her reputation. Criminal charges followed. As for me, I used the money Dad had left me, combined with investors who remembered and respected him, to purchase the remains of Hartwell Auto from bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. One by one, I contacted the mechanics and staff who had been let go, offering them their jobs back. I reopened the original garage first, hanging the same sign my father had proudly displayed years ago. But even as I rebuilt what was taken from me, I found the victory hollow in unexpected ways. Dad was still gone. The business would never be the same. And I'd discovered a capacity for calculating revenge I never knew I possessed. Sometimes at night, alone in the office that had once been my father's, I wonder if he would recognize the person I've become. If the price of justice was too high. Then I look at the photo on the wall, Dad standing in front of that first garage, arm around my 8-year-old shoulders, and I know I did what needed to be done. The legacy continues. But so do the questions.